Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. This week's layout design is another N-scale project. And what was interesting at the time is that I was working on 3 N-scale layout designs simultaneously, all of which were in squarish areas. There was a spare bedroom design that I presented recently. This one is a 2-car garage. And the third one I was working on at this time was for a much larger basement size layout in N-scale, but you'll have to wait for that one. Overall, it is about 19 feet by 21, I think. There is a closet in one corner. There is a sink in another. There is a door to a utility area, which is only occasionally used. Here is the 2-car vehicular door, the door of the house, and there is one support column near the middle of the room. The client wanted a layout representing a main line from the California coast running inland through a mountain range. And he didn't want it necessarily to represent any of the existing routes that do that. He wanted it to be an entirely freelance railroad, just using the other California passes like Cajon and Tehachapi as inspiration, but being entirely double-tracked. He wanted probably about half of the railroad to be composed of large accommodating yards and some fairly decent sized industries in the other portion of the railroad. Right off the bat he said he didn't care about this closet, we could block it if necessary. So I responded by asking what happens if we take it out completely. So let me show what happens to the space if we do that. Here is the revised space with the front of the closet removed. The side has been kept because the client thought that the front end of this side wall was a necessary structural column to support the top of the stairs. The ceiling height at the back of the closet is a little bit lower than normal. I don't remember what it was, but it was just about high enough for the upper deck of his 2-deck layout, as long as we were at the lowest point on the upper level instead of a higher point. Anyway, as usual, I started by drawing footprints just to see what would fit. At first I was trying to keep the crossing of the door onto a branch line, so that suggested putting a harbour line along this top wall. In this one the yards would stretch around the north side and the end of the peninsula, with the inside being the mountainous area. This version puts the peninsula from the south wall instead of the east and wraps it in a U shape. The yards now being along 2 outside walls, with the entire U-shaped peninsula being devoted to the mountains. Here is another variation where the peninsula bends the other way. Instead of spiralling round, it's now an S shape. Here I've tried to stretch the length of the mountainous run at the expense of introducing a narrow aisle between the 2 lobes of the mountains. And this narrow aisle probably would not be an issue, since most of the time he's going to be operating by himself anyway, and even if he does have guests over, it's unlikely that there would ever need to be 2 train crews in this aisle at the same time. The next series of designs try using the space a little bit differently. In this footprint, the moving section across the door has now become incorporated into part of the main line. Before suggesting the next few footprints, I did make sure that the client was comfortable in his ability to make the drop gate reliable, and he said he was. So here I've just run around the 2 walls on the outside and then connected up 2 peninsulas from the north wall. And I wasn't quite sure how best to use this, so I tried a variation of it. Here we have 1 peninsula coming from each of the side walls of the garage. At this point I'm figuring that we'll have the yard areas on the east and north walls, with the harbour on the north peninsula, and an L-shaped area for the mountains. And then here is another design. Rather than use up a lot of space with the harbour, we felt that a dwarf peninsula would be sufficient for that, allowing for a second full-size peninsula for the mountainous areas. And we felt this was a better use of the space. The key to it being whether or not the closet was wide enough to get a double-track Helix in it. And although it was going to be somewhat less than what we'd selected elsewhere for the minimum radius, we discovered that there was room for 15-inch radius on the inside track, and by elongating the helix it would still fit. Since I'm not hugely experienced with N-scale, I did request that the client did some tests with his larger locomotives and longest freight cars to make sure that they would work reliably on a 15-inch radius curve, and he reported back that they were fine. I thought they would be, but it was well to make sure. And by elongating the helix into an oval instead of a circle, we can still get enough circumference to gain enough rise per lap to make it accessible. Anyway, after getting all the preliminary testing out of the way, this was the footprint that the client and I decided to go with. In this next drawing, this shows how I intended to utilize the space. Here we can see the elongated helix in the top left corner, and the first yard section is shared with a small intermodal yard along the back and a small local yard serving the various industries in the harbour area. His main freight yard would be on the east wall in front of the Amtrak station. There's plenty of room for engine servicing, bearing in mind that it's a diesel era layout, so we don't need a space-consuming turntable and roundhouse. And I've indicated several locations where we can get decent-sized industries in. On this first run out of the city, suggested using the entire area for a single large industry, keeping the area through the mountains completely open, just nothing but plain scenery, and then another smaller town before disappearing off the visible portion, where I figured there could be one large industry and several smaller ones. So we now have two double track helixes. We got the broad radius circular helix down here and the tighter elongated one in the closet. Both have about the same circumference. And here is the lower deck with a big staging yard underneath the main freight and passenger areas, and reversing loops under both helixes for turning trains. Now I've shown different ways of hooking up the reversing loops. Here is just a single turnout onto the reverse loop. Here we have a junction on each side of the main line with grades coming down, and this arrangement is far better. It allows for the two reversing loops and the staging yard to form a continuous circuit just to be able to get something running, albeit non-scenic, before the client has to invest the time in building the helixes and the upper deck. Anyway, the client wrote back and said that he loved the use of the space, and he immediately saw the advantage of this arrangement for the reversing loop in the north over the one in the south. Here is the lower deck, more fully utilized. I've added auxiliary staging yards at both ends of the main yard. I have adjusted the other reversing loop to have the same arrangement, allowing for continuous running, and also indicated how it can be extended and run through an isolated scenic section underneath the main deck. I've also showed space for a control cabinet and material storage under the remainder of the space. As soon as the client saw this additional scenic section on the lower deck, he was really excited, because being isolated from the main area, it gives the opportunity for a completely different kind of scenery. So instead of being the drab desert browns, he can have a lush wooded area if he wants it. By this time, the client had decided what he wanted for the major industries. He wanted a trona mine. There are a few of those in California, and I wasn't sure what a trona mine was. It turns out that it's a fine powder-like material. I think it's a kind of talc, but anyway, it's shipped in covered hoppers. He also wanted a major grain elevator and a tire plant. I've shown the tire plant as being the big industry on the first peninsula. The small town is a good opportunity for one of the other industries, although this time I hadn't decided which. Putting the mine there allows the grain elevator to be somewhere else, whereas if you put the grain elevator here, the mine really doesn't fit anywhere. I did end up moving them around later. Now this view looks like it's out of sequence because the lower level has been developed a lot more fully than I normally do at this stage of the design, so we'll probably come back to this later. Here is another version of the upper level with the main industries in their final locations. In fact, I've even completely filled in the trona mine. The client sent me several links to trona mines on Google Maps, and I selected the smallest of those arrangements, and even so I had to greatly condense it to get it into the space available. I forget which mine it was, I just know it was the smallest one. And it did have several other subsidiary industries as part of it, There was a large warehouse of some kind with a single long spur down one side, and there was a much smaller loading facility off the side. I have no idea what it's for. It is probably some kind of byproduct. But here is the main facilities, and this is fairly close to the arrangement of the actual plant, although, as I said, greatly reduced. And I found room for a 3-track yard dedicated to the industry. We decided that all trains from this yard are going to head over the visible portion of the mine and head out through the North Helix instead of just going straight down. That gives us more trains over the visible portion of the line for everyone that has to run the Helix. But with that directional specific operating pattern in mind, we noticed that there is no connection back out onto the main line at this end. This 3rd track around the middle is just a stub-ended yard lead. At one point I experimented with a curved crossover in this corner, just after the tunnel that helps to disguise the support column. But with the track range that we were using, that ended up putting an 18-inch radius curve on the main line. Because the Pico turnouts that he was using, the curved turnouts has an inside radius of 18 inches. And elsewhere, the visible main line minimum is 22 inches. So we abandoned the curved crossover, and instead we decided that empties for the Troner mine would have to run wrong road from the crossovers in this corner. Now this is common practice on double track main lines nationwide, where most tracks are signalled for both directions. And we have a short section where the double track main is divided into 2 single tracks, and the intention is to build the scenery in such a way that that looked like a more economical option than trying to get 2 tracks through the same area. Anyway, at this point in the process, the cement plant is now the big industry on this first peninsula, and the Goodyear tyre plant is now going to be put in this corner. Also in this view, I have connected up all the yard areas with proper turnout ladders. I've used the long turnouts for the main yard, which are 36-inch radius. I have a simple ladder at one end and a compound ladder at the other end to save space, also using some curved turnouts, which are 1836. I've also used the long turnouts exclusively for all mainline crossovers and for the intermodal yard. The small local yard uses the medium turnouts, which are 18-inch radius. Now there are 2 tracks in this yard that have reverse curves. It is the 2nd track from the back at this end and the 3rd from the front at this end. And since there are some auto rack spurs, I suggested that the client avoided using those 2 tracks for auto racks. All the other industries in this area will be served by short cars, where the 18-inch radius reverse curves are not a problem. Don't forget, this is N scale, so that would be equivalent to about 33 inches in HO. In this next plan, I have filled in the cement plant and the tyre plant. Once again, these 2 are greatly reduced from satellite images of real plants that the client sent me. With the cement plant, I ran the arrival tracks through the loading shed, which disguises them passing through the backdrop into some storage tracks. And this creates a loads in, empties out arrangement. The rear track is the loads in, goes through the unloader, so the switcher will push a cut of cars through there, and then reverse and use the bypass track to pull a cut of empty cars back out again. Now if we just had 2 tracks behind the backdrop, that operation would be doable once per operating session, but with a pair of turnouts and 4 trucks behind the backdrop, that operation can be done twice per session. On the output side of the plant, I had to reduce the arrangement from having separate yards for empties and loads because there just wasn't room for it. So I've put a short double-ended track through the loading shed, and the idea being that the same yard will serve both loads and empties. Since we're dealing with covered hoppers, it's not obvious which is which, so if an operator forgets and makes a mistake, it really doesn't matter, because a loaded train will look much like an empty one. And something else you may notice is the arrangement of the cement plant, and this is based on the HO scale version of the Walters Valley cement kit. Since the back walls don't need to be modelled, they can be cut out to provide extra material to block off the overscale windows in the front wall. And overall, these HO scale structures are a sensible size for N scale. And even there, I added a 2nd set of silos, because the prototype plan showed a much bigger storage area. Now the other big industry, the Goodyear tyre plant, has also been filled in this corner. And here I had only a fraction of the available space used up by the prototype plant. So I just selected a few interesting areas from the real plant and incorporated those into a design that looked reasonable. There was two long parallel loading tracks down the side of a long warehouse. There was a couple of sharply curved short delivery tracks through a chemical area, and there was two very long spurs either side of a tank unloading rack that had covered unloading points to provide shade for the workers, and I thought that was an interesting idea to be worth modelling. There was also two long storage tracks paralleling that unloading area, and on the model I've kept those, although they now have to serve double duty because the prototype plant also had two 9-track stub-ended yards, one on each side, which in the satellite photograph were chock-a-block with tank cars. So these two long spurs will have to suffice to do that. Anyway, that is the layout pretty much worked out. All the track and major industries have been worked out. Here is the lower level with all the elevations worked out. And here is the upper level again, also with the elevations filled in. Here is the final version with all the scenic treatments drawn in. You may notice that I'm not as good at drawing desert scenery as I am at drawing greener landscapes, but the client knew what I meant here. It's just a rocky desert with dry washes rather than raging rivers. We do have two water features on the upper deck. There is the harbour area and a drainage canal, which are common features in the LA area. Something else that I included in the cement plant was something I copied from the original. The office building was surrounded by a large, lush garden, giving a park-like effect. So I've included that here. In the harbour area, you may have noticed earlier that the pier was divided between general merchandise and an oil terminal, since there were several oil terminals in the LA harbour area. We decided that that really crammed it in too much, so I've now given over the entire pier to a single warehouse for general merchandise, which is of a far more believable size. And I've moved the oil terminal to the spur at the rear, which didn't really have a lot of room for driveways around it, so we now have a pipe bridge to a small wharf served by barges. I've also extended one spur off the edge of the benchwork behind this dock basin, implying that there are other piers that we haven't modelled. And at the other end of this small yard there is an industrial spur also heading off stage, implying that there is another unmodelled facility in this area. So those two spurs give the impression that the harbour extends in both directions and that there is far more to it than we've actually modelled. Here is the lower level with the scenic portion filled in. I've shown two valleys, once again separated by the tunnel because we have to pass very close to the support column. I've drawn a tall trestle across a deep valley on the one side and a much shallower valley with the river meandering alongside the railroad for some distance on the other. I was also able to slew this isle slightly, allowing the base of the peninsula to be a little bit wider, getting the Helix further from the side and allowing the scenic section to be continued beside the Helix, adding about another 4 feet of visible run. Anyway, that was the final design. The client did ask for a little bit of clarification on how the drop flaps would work, so I drew him a separate drawing for that. Here is the view from the operator side. The lower level has the hinges on the right side, and it hinges up inside the angled area of the upper deck. The main deck flap hinges the other way, and note how the buildings have to be designed to miss each other at that point. Let me go back to an earlier view and show you how this works. Note the angled joint at this end. The angle is fine because the hinge is at the other end, and it means that the mainline tracks cross it at close to 90 degrees, which is far more reliable. So the angled end does double duty, not only improving reliability, but also providing a pocket for the lower flap to hinge up into. Anyway, that completes this layout design. Feel free to go back and pause any slide that you want more time to view. I'm going to sign off here, and I hope to see you back next week. So in the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.